I'm grateful that Ravi came today, and I'm grateful for the presentation that he made. And I'm grateful to have Stan here, and I'm way off track on the message I was supposed to bring. And so if we can have my slide, what we are thinking about, and this is part of my personal journey, is Christ-centered community development. When I was a missionary doing church planting, I had 5 people that had come to the Lord, and we were meeting together. They were going to be the elders of the church, and I asked them, what's the mission of the church? And they said to me, well, the mission of the church is to love your neighbor, love God, and love your neighbor. And I said, no, the mission of the church is to save souls. And saved souls love God and love their neighbor. That's what I had been taught in seminary. But in my conversations with them, I realized that I was prioritizing the commands of Christ rather than finding a way to do everything that Christ has commanded. And when I come to them with word and not deed, I probably bring an argument, but leave them without a true picture of who Jesus is. And so the journey in my life became, how do I bring these things together? And how do I join together 2 things that had been separated by my tradition? In my own schools, I was taught the mission of the church is evangelism and church planting. And it's the liberals that do the social stuff. And so that's where I was. And then after repenting, I went on a journey, and I ended up with Che. I started a holistic church planting institute. We planted 11 churches in 18 months. What we were doing was going to the city and getting money and food and clothes from them and delivering it to the village and preaching to the crowds. And what happened in our church planting venture is people came into the church for the wrong reasons. Pastor ran out because he was accused of keeping money that we gave to him when we in fact hadn't given him any money. And I thought to myself, this is not working. So I came home with a whole nother set of questions, and that's when I read Stan's overview for Che, and I said, this is it. What we need to bring to people is we need to empower them to walk with Christ, to let his values change their families and their communities. And we need to quit prioritizing the commands of Christ and find a way to do everything Jesus commanded. That is Christ-centered community development. And what we're seeing around the world is communities lifting themselves out of cycles of poverty and disease, and the church being established in the center as the agent of transformation that God intends it to be when he said, you are the light of the world. We have a much greater opportunity with the poor than just to finish projects, to paint their buildings, or to help them put a roof on a church, and that's not what God has actually called us to do as his church and as the agent of transformation. If you were one of the disciples and you heard Jesus say, you're going to take the gospel from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the earth. Or you heard him say, you're going to make disciples of all nations. I think if I were there would have been all kinds of questions raised in my mind. Wait a minute. I can paint a building, and I can work with a village, but Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the uttermost parts of the earth, make disciples of all nations? And Jesus never retracted that. And you know what happened? The disciples that were filled with the Spirit did exactly what he asked them to do and catalyzed movements that changed the world. And in every generation, we are responsible to make sure that we get the gospel to the uttermost parts of the earth. And one of the things that concerns me right now in missions is that everybody is focused on the city. And there are people that are being left behind. And the ones that are being left behind are classified as some of the least reached. And if we're really going to get the gospel to the uttermost, we've got to have a strategy that includes the village. Thus, the Million Village Challenge. I want to ask you this question, though. Can the work that you're doing in mission, does it have the potential to catalyze a movement? That's a deep question. But I think it's a question we need to answer. And in my experience working with the poor, I have found 5 things that characterize movements of transformation among the poor. And I'm going to give them to you today in an acrostic claim. Can you claim that what your church is doing in the area of mission has the potential to catalyze a movement and change the world? And the first thing is, we have to understand that we are no longer the epicenter of mission in America. And that movements, national movements, are catalyzed by nationals. There's one here with us today. Ugo, where are you? Can you stand up, Ugo? How long, Ugo, have you been doing Che?
Since 1989, when Stan trained me.
Okay, so you've been at it longer than me. How many villages have you reached in that time?
In Mesoamerica, it's over 250 communities.
250 communities in 40 years. And what's your vision? How old are you, by the way? Forgive me for asking.
How old?
Yes.
66.
66? And what's your vision for the next 10 years?
To have a Che training team in every ethnic group in Latin America.
All right. Have you set a number?
Not really, but that's my dream.
That's your dream. But you told us last night 590, and you're working with Ricardo on a number bigger than that. We won't steal his thunder, but we'll let you, right? So here's a national. I have known him to be one of the humblest men I have ever met. And if you spend time with him, you would never think he's turning the world upside down, but in reality, he is. National movements are led by nationals. And our strategies need to empower champions because champions catalyze movements. So that's the first C in claim. It's catalyzed by champions. The second thing, if you want to catalyze a movement, your work needs to be locally owned. So what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that if you come in from the outside with all the resources to do a project, and you decide what the priorities are going to be, and you decide the timeline, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, you have the ownership from the outside. That will be a project, but it will never be a movement. If you want a movement, you've got to allow the people in the community to assess their own needs, to choose their own priorities, to identify local resources, to create local solutions to their problems and to repeat that cycle again and again. So if you look at the Che structure, we have two important groups of people operating, three actually, but from the village itself. You have a committee elected by the community that's trained by the trainers coming from the outside in project cycle management. The committee learns to assess their needs, to choose priorities, to identify local resources, to create solutions, and then to evaluate and to repeat that cycle. All over the world, villages without help from the outside are building schools, diversifying their agriculture. They are putting in clean water systems. They're putting in sanitation systems. And because they're using local resources to do it, they can multiply that to their neighbors. They don't have to bring in thousands of dollars to do the next thing in the next place because they used local resources. We'll talk about that in a minute more. But let's go to asset-based. Asset-based ministry looks at what people have. The wrong question to enter a community with is, what do you need? That's a sure way to set up a project, because they're going to see you coming. They're going to see you're wearing shoes that have a cover. You're going to see that you came in a four-wheel drive. They're going to see dollar signs in your eyes, and they're going to tell you, this is what I need, and then they're going to wait for you to do it. And you will deliver a service, but you will not catalyze a movement. We need a different approach, an asset-based approach. We need to see people not as victims of circumstance, but as stewards of resources. Isn't that basic to our gospel? We have been made in the image of God. And the first thing that God said to us as humans was what? Take dominion. You were not made to be a victim. You were not made to be a dependent on spirits. Or you were made in the image of God as a steward of resources. That implies there are resources. And one of the problems we have coming in from the outside is that we're completely blind to their resources. We think they have nothing, and we set ourselves up as the decision makers for them, and that's where we fall down. If we want movements, we want asset-based approaches that focus not on what they need, but what they have. So they already know the needs, and they will, if you come in and ask them to make a list of needs and you hold that up in front of them, you probably raised expectations or you killed their hope. One of the two. But if you come in and you make a list of resources that they have and you hold that up against the problem, they begin to create a solution. And that's how we get to multiplying sustainable community development. So, movements are catalyzed by champions. What's the second one? Locally owned. Third? Asset-based. And fourth, here it is, integrated. I was doing some consultation with the government in Korea. And we do an exercise that says ideas have consequences. What you believe shapes your values determine your behaviors, and your behaviors have a consequence in the community. And so we did this exercise with these leaders of a large aid organization in Korea. And there were a couple of people in the room that began to cry. And it was a solemn moment, actually. So I just stopped and I asked, what's wrong? And they said, we can't touch the roots of the poverty problem because we won't go to their beliefs and their values. And that's what's different about Christian ministry, we start with beliefs and values, right? The transformation is from the inside out. That's how it works. And so our ministries need to be integrated. Ideas do have consequences. The gospel says we are made in the image of God and we are stewards of resources. The gospel says that the world was made for us, not us for the world. The gospel says that the world is broken because of sin. The gospel teaches us and lays a foundation for us that makes true development possible. So it's no mystery why what we think of as development anyway, a lot of it began in the Western world. Because it begins with worldview and with beliefs and with values. And it's never enough. Here's my fear. A generation past, church leaders were all about evangelism and rejected social gospels. And there were reasons for that. I'm not being judgmental. I'm making an observation. That's what we did. All right? And so we did evangelism. My son's generation is going to abandon evangelism and do social action. But Jesus is not at either extreme. Jesus is a radical middle. The same Jesus who said, preach the forgiveness of sins, also said, if you've done it to the least of them, you've done it to me. We can't separate our worship from the needs of the poor. Our ministries have to be integrated. My pastor is here. Isaac, stand up for a minute. I'm going to put him on the spot. This is my pastor from Payson. What I love about him is that he understands transformation. In our church, there are 4 rows at the front. We usually sit behind them of men who are recovering drug addicts. And you hear those men stand and tell how many people they witnessed to this week and the changes that are going on in their life. And Isaac is right there behind the scenes working to see that transformation happen. But that takes you into the weeds. It's not just about forgiveness of sins. It's about broken families. It's about finding jobs. It's about a lot of things that Jesus wants to correct. If we look at why Jesus came, it was not just to save us from hell. It was to restore to us everything that was lost in the fall. And so if his kingdom is reflected in goodness and in kindness and in love and in power, then our ministries need to reflect those things. Our ministries need to be integrated. We need to find a way that we are ministering to the communities around us in word and deed. When I was a church planter, I was running around the outside of the community yelling about the forgiveness of sins. And some people heard me and came and joined me, but they were hated by the community just like I was. The only thing I brought to them was theological argument in the eyes of the community. But that's not what I want to bring to them. I want to bring Jesus in all his fullness and all his mercy and all his love. And that means our ministries have to be integrated. And then the last thing, if you want a movement, by the way, there's a relationship. The last thing is multiplying. I think the test of real success for me is not how many people are sitting in front of me in an audience, but it's how many generations of disciples are following Christ. And I want to think in terms of generations, not just in terms of crowds. Because what Jesus said to his disciples was, make disciples who will make disciples. It was multiplication that got the church to where it is today, and we can't abandon that. So the question is, the work that I'm doing in the village, is it multipliable? That question takes you beyond the question of sustainability, which has been all the topic for a long time. Is what we're doing going to remain? But that's not the end question. The end question, and you know, we think about poverty as a lack of stuff. The poor think about poverty as a lack of voice. And when we fail to multiply, we give them stuff, but we don't give them voice. And until they're multiplying, then we're not getting where we want to go. So that's it. Playing. Catalyzed by champions. What's the second one? Local resources. The third one? Asset-based. The fourth? Integrated. And the fifth? Multiplying. Multiplying. Can we go to the next slide? That's a review. Here's the Million Village Challenge. My friend Hal, who is with the Lord now, brought this to me. He worked together with Jeff. Jeff, where are you? Stand up. You got to stand up, Jeff. Come on. Hal worked with Jeff to imagine this Million Village Challenge that has become a reality. And we are seeing the church around the world mobilized to multiply Christ-centered community development in ways that we have the potential to reach 1 million villages, which is the number of villages out there that need to be reached. And so here's how it will work. We're sitting right here. Where are you, Ricardo? Ricardo's coming up after me. How many villages are you going to start work in Latin America? 2033 by 2033. We think if we can get to 10,000 villages, model villages around the world, and then multiply them into clusters, we'll have 100,000 villages. How does that work? You start a model, they have water, they have sanitation, they have food security, they have good infrastructure, they have business, they have enterprise. The villages around that are connected to them in some way are looking at this and they're saying, wow, I want that. So what we've learned from experience is there is a pull, but there also has to be a push. And we have to help the communities that we're developing see the opportunity that is theirs to multiply what they're doing in a cluster of villages around. And so the idea is 10,000 models, and Ricardo's going to do 2,000 of those. We probably already have thousands, I don't know the count. What do you have at Medical Ambassadors? How many villages are you working in? 2,600 villages in Medical Ambassadors. World Challenge, how many? Do you know? Steve?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure.
Not 100% sure. But it's significant, right? So, we've got organizations around here that working on this. And our goal is 10,000 villages, model villages, multiplying into 100,000 through clusters. And we believe if we get there, and they're scattered throughout the developing world strategically, we have reached a tipping point and created a movement that has the possibility of finishing itself. So that's where we're going. I want to ask you to get your program out, and I want to finish by reading together with you a pledge. We are working at building a website right now that's not yet ready. Even though the URL is here, the website's not up the way it should be, so don't go looking for it. But it is coming. And it's going to be the Million Village Challenge website where we challenge the local churches globally to take this pledge. And I want to ask you to read it out loud with me. Undertake the pledge. We believe that the gospel of Jesus, everybody read with me. We believe that the gospel of Jesus is good news to the poor. We hear Jesus saying, whatever you do to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you do to me. Jesus feels their struggle and calls us to respond to their pain. Therefore, we commit to support efforts among the poor that make disciples, address the root causes of human deprivation, lift communities out of cycles of poverty and disease, and multiply that success to communities around. That's my challenge. If you're here representing a church today, I invite you to meet with the leaders of your church and take the pledge. Those of you who are already in part doing Che ministry around the world and organizations that are involved, we've already taken this pledge.